Before I start, I want to acknowledge the Ohlone whose land we're on. As I always say, I know we did this earlier in the day, but I think, you know, to end with that also and end with the future of Ohlone people is also important. And I appreciated the opening, which is the kind of opening I feel we should always give, which is a historic and future orientation of whose land we're on. So I appreciate that, Janelle. So also before I begin, there's two things that as I planned this talk, things have happened. And so I'm going to start with two scale points right now. And the first one I'm going to start with is like talking a little bit about where I'm from, which is Tonawanda, Seneca, and what that means. And then I'm going to talk about a much larger scale and something much important that recently happened in the last couple of days. So this particular story began with my uncle, who said, Mishuana, you know, you have this fancy PhD, you could have gone to law school, but you have this PhD, so, you know, I want you to come home and help me make this movie. And then he wanted to make a particular movie about Niagara Falls and some of the stories that he was told and given by an elder in the Longhouse. And so, you know, I took oral history classes. I'm a literature person. I miss that. And so I took some oral history classes, tried to figure out how to get all the skills, whatever. I get back to the res. My uncle laughs at that, first of all. He's like, you have to take classes now to hear my stories? So I was like, well, I just want to make sure I do it right. I show up with my fancy equipment, et cetera, et cetera. So he starts to tell me the story where this kind of originated and how I began thinking about it. I took a trip to Niagara Falls, etc. But during the course, he tells me the story, and this is the kind of story that he tells me, right, about how Niagara Falls came into being. And this is a time before humans, right, where the non-humans existed. And that there was this, and I'm going to briefly tell it, and I'm by no means the storyteller my uncle is, right? I don't have enough bravado or something about that. But what happened was there was a talk between the rocks and the wind, right? And it was about who was strongest, competition. That's how us Haudenosaunee roll. It's all about competition. So even in the non-human. So what happened is the rocks were the strongest, or seen as the strongest beings, right? And they were saying that the wind, because it had no strength, etc., in that materiality, that they weren't as strong as the rocks. So this became a competition, etc., between that. But so the wind says, you know, that this isn't true, so they enter into this bet. So during the course, and this is kind of the framing for what I'm going to get into, which is about different temporalities and dispossession and power and different conceptions of power, is that the rocks, then over time, the wind blew the water, and the water withered away the rocks, and that's how we came to get Niagara Falls. But in that process, the rocks, in the nature of the bet, the rocks themselves lost their voice, right? So this becomes part of my uncle's story, which he wanted me to film, but I was like, maybe we could do animation, etc. But that sends me off in a different direction. But as I was then going to Niagara Falls and looking around, not as just somebody going to Niagara Falls after visiting home, but somebody who was actually thinking about the story my uncle told me, but also about my research, this project kind of came into being. I was thinking about, as I was walking, there's absolutely no naming of Seneca people or Tuscarora, and I will get into that. And that's an important factor of the falls, and this is an important factor of thinking through indigenous futurities that are not confined in logical containments of bounded jurisdictions, right? And the Tuscarora are an important people in terms of rethinking how Native people are thought of, not only in geography, anthropology, literature, etc. So this story for us becomes extremely important. Now that's one scale. That's my personal scale, where this particular paper comes from. The other scale that I want to address right now, and this will make more sense as I go through this paper, is I want to acknowledge the death of Berta Caceres in Honduras, who was an indigenous activist who fought against the damming of her land, who fought with her life amidst threats, and the Honduran dictatorship right now is in part and parcel. Also, the US government has a role to play in this, right? Now, I bring that up because this talk is not just about the oral story that my Uncle Horst told me. It's also about settler colonialism and hydroelectric projects. And so as I go through this paper, I'm going to be talking about what the death of the Native woman meant metaphorically here, but also materially. And when I can't help but not address that other scale, because the technology for hydroelectric damming begins at Niagara Falls. And it begins between the settler colonial states of Canada and the US. And it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop. It's in Honduras, and it resulted in the death of Berta Caceres, who was protecting the Rio Blanco River, a river that they protected because it was imbued with female spirits, and it was seen as the mother river for those particular spirits that were center of her village and of her life. So I want to acknowledge that because it correlates as well to Haudenosaunee at a different scale. So this is our territory, historic and current Haudenosaunee territory here. And you can see, does that show up on the screen? Okay. It doesn't show up on the screen, but you can see where Tonawanda is there, and you see Buffalo and the Tuscarora Nation as well, and you can see how in close proximity they are as well. So I'm going to begin my story here, but I hope as we go through, we can think about what it means, these technologies of power, and how they have long historic vertical depth. So monument making at the turn of the 19th century was a common practice meant to convey a symbolic message of united peoples. But like much monument making, it not only conveyed the message of the state, but also produced an effective mapping of nation states, genders, and technologies. Jonathan Flatley, who Avron spoke about earlier, writes that an effective map is, quote, is a map less in a sense that it establishes territory than it is about providing a feeling of orientation and facilitating mobility. Just for an example, we can think about this as the way that the US doesn't view Canada necessarily as a foreign entity, but just as a surplus US kind of space, right? Even though there's two different regimes of settler colonialism. For Flatley, effective attachment is an act of doing, a kind of energy that mobilizes subjects and enables them to imagine and cohere as a community. Niagara Falls has become an important monument, physically marking the boundary of the United States' northern border and Canada's southern border. Even more so, it ideologically marks recognition of co-constitutive settler power, where might over right wins out in the delving out of resources. It is a power imbued with compulsory heterosexuality, as an investigation of this site makes clear. Practices at the Falls are bounded in gender normativities, formative at this point in time that did not coincidentally coincide with the domestication of Indian lands post-reservation era. As others have written, it was a time when mass white settler violence turned to the rhetorical. Though let there be no question about how the rhetorical, the collection and taxonomical ordering and circulation of apocryphal stories continue to cause ongoing deaths and violence. We saw this in the previous talk that we just heard. What we begin to see in this moment is the tourist quality of interpreting Indians into colonial nostalgia, or what Renato Rosaldo states is imperialist nostalgia, or a move that, quote, makes racial domination appear innocent and pure by making the colonizer think that they respect what they have tried to destroy. So the first half of the 19th century was about the harnessing of Haudenosaunee lands and waterways. Part and parcel of this was creating a visual and narrative apparatus that would see Native peoples as collectible souvenirs in the burgeoning of the settler states. As such, the collection of souvenirs and trinkets were an important part of the industry at Niagara Falls. The The geographic site was a nostalgic site where white settlers could mourn the passing of the ideal pastoral while they welcomed the future of hydroelectric power and industry. And here we can think of the way that kitsch plays, right? The premise that kitsch is the move away from alienating labor even further and further and further. And that will come into play as I talk about the beadwork that was sold at the falls themselves. The geographic site was this where they could mourn the passing of the pastoral while they welcomed the future of the hydroelectric power and industry. As tourist magazines and newspapers stated, the important role that Niagara Falls plays in the American imaginings is that Niagara Falls, quote, was to be the focus of the future. The future in Native people, as well as a rising middle class based on the bourgeois family, required a colonial nostalgia, or to continue with Rosaldo, white settlers had to, quote, remain essentially different from the people they colonized, thus allowing the colonizers to justify their conquest. Rifkin's been quoted a lot here, but there's many indigenous, feminist, etc. that also talk about this straightening of Indians as well. Rifkin puts it into a very legal terminology in relation to this particular narrative. As a monumental site, Niagara Falls is at once configured as a sacrifice and allegorical woman in the Maid of the Mist concoction and a monument of capitalism and masculinism. Okay. The death of an Indian woman was a story that became fact in 1846 by the incorporation of the Maid of the Mist tours, a story that served not only to draw tourists near and far, but one that also continues to perpetuate Haudenosaunee as cruel and savage. This story intertwines with capitalist endeavors, used and still uses the visual sights of the subliminal landscape while promoting a romantic vision of Indian women who never are named by their nations. It's always the chief's daughter, right? At this point in time, the intertwining of the pastoral was used to promote inventive electrical wonders. Now we see both being nostalgic, effectively mapped as if they occurred in different pasts. It was a monument that symbolized the nexus of ridding the past from the primitive and harnessing and domesticating the land and water for the future of nations. In the slides I present here, I would like you to notice the move towards whiteness as artists rendition the tales, which coincide with the development along the riverbanks. So I'm just going to go through a few slides here that you can see. This postcard is from the 1920s, and these circulated globally as well. Early rendition from 1908, a later rendition of the Maid of the Mist. This one is from the 1940s, 50s. And here's the 1950s rendition from a pinup calendar. So you can see, I'm glad we don't have a green screen. I was going to say you can go to the darker green, but you can see how whiteness comes into play pretty much in relation to these particular slides. So for Haudenosaunee people, however, the falls have not only been an historical trading place and market, but they are also a place of significant social and cultural importance. It is a place with many stories, one where the powerful thunder beings reside. It is significant to Haudenosaunee practices among the 6 nations that make up the Confederacy. The falls are also a place that marks a struggle for power, and I mean this both literally and figuratively, of the co-constitutive settler states of Canada and the U.S. Built up as a tour site in the early 1900s and later marketed as a honeymoon site, Niagara Falls became an important geographical area to extend my previous work, which examined state-produced spaces, such as the making of monuments and jurisdictions, and indigenous placemaking, such as the reflection of experiences through intergenerational stories regarding specific sites that in turn produce different value systems from that of the U.S. nation state. Well, hopefully. I mean, there's still some work to do among our native nations. So, if we consider Scott Morganson's argument that, quote, the terrorizing sexual colonization of native peoples was a historical root of the biopolitics of modern sexuality in the United States, we can then place an important site of this biopolitical practice at the falls themselves. Not only do we see a constituting of heteronormative coupling, we also trace the Americanizing through a climb and class practices rooted in the tourist industry and the consumption of natural resources that would give rise to industrialization. So in later work and in a broader work, I tend to bring in a little bit of the tourism and tourism economy literature, but for right now, I'm sticking with the story, so to speak, of what I'm holding to be important here. The falls hold these multiple histories and native mappings that precede and perhaps also aid in the current received histories of Niagara Falls that many of are aware of in dominant society. Yet the place in the collection of Niagara Falls is useful to decipher as we begin to grasp its importance as a place that gave rise to white American middle-class bourgeois family practices, such as vacations and the practices of honeymoons, and simultaneously the site of the invention of hydroelectric power that would have an impact of devouring native lands on a much broader spectrum. Again, I want us to remember Honduras today. The logics of capitalism operated full scale at the Falls site, and here we can see a picture of it. Really rarely are these two instances brought into conversation. McGreevy writes about the interplay between technology and the romanticization of the Falls. He says, and he's a pretty typical historian in many ways, but his work is useful here. He says, Niagara remained inaccessible even to North American centers of population until the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825. But even with the beginning of tourism on a large scale, the image of a fabulous remote waterfall did not entirely perish. People simply found new ways of imagining it as if it was remote. One of these ways, often expressed in a traveler's accounts and poetry, was to see Niagara as a symbol of death. And how many people here have been to Niagara Falls? Have you guys? Yeah, so quite a few people, right? So it is quite a stunning place when you see it. You can tell that it's a place of power. So at the heart of this symbol, however, was the death of a nameless but pure native maid killed by the cruelty of her savage ancestors. Akil Mdimde argues in a different context, but one well suited here, that colonialism, quote, helped produce an imaginary capacity, or what I am terming settler effective mapping. And it converts, quote, converts the founding violence into authorizing authority. So here, deciphering the historical roots of honeymooning and the foundations of hydroelectric power at this site are key for combating the epistemic violence that those seemingly innocent and romantic stories and visuals depict. In dominant society, the story of the Maid of the Mist is perhaps the most popular, coinciding and reiterating values regarding virginity, purity, and sacrifice. An epitome of paternalism, and I want to also say maternalism, because too often we leave white women off the hook, as Margaret Jacobs makes clear in her work, that the story effectively maps settler placemaking. And I bring this up here because it's also something that, in thinking through the Niagara Falls as a honeymoon site, it's also important to think of that maternalism that comes into play as well. Sue Wilson compactly iterates the capitalist story widely accepted, though widely fought by Haudenosaunee people. Quote, the non-native revisionist versions, however, demonize native culture by inventing a narrative that has the maiden being the victim of an annual human sacrifice ritual, which is part of traditional Iroquois custom. Unfortunately, the melodramatic, beautiful Indian maiden sacrificed against her will and annual appease to the gods now or pay in spades later kind of narrative, right? This swiftly adopted popular culture is part and parcel of a network of tales that attempt to disempower Haudenosaunee people by telling accounts of savagery and brutal violence. Tales still celebrated even in literature touted as Native American. Whoops, how far behind am I? Oh shoot. Hold on. I think I bring it up again later, but I wanted to make sure I get to it. There we go. Even in such contemporary novels by Boyran, the Aranda, or in mythologies purported by the Canadian government, where stands for sovereignty are considered militant and hostile acts. both the social and cultural political work in these economies of dispossession, that is, they are active mechanisms of state power that serve to provide power. Double entendre purposeful here, right? To the settler whose life is valued, and death to the natives who must go the ways of pristine nature. This decontextualizing of native stories of place and presence are necessary. This story coincides with Niagara as a honeymoon destination of that moment where nations' inheritance is affirmed through reproduction, affirms Euro place making, claiming, its heteronormative nature and its futurity. So in other words, the heteronormative coupling is also a reproduction of the consistently of the white heteronormative middle class nation state here. So Avery Gordon in Ghostly Matters, Haunting in the Sociological Imagination, defines haunting as, quote, an animated state in which a repressed or unresolved social violence is making itself known. The hold of the death of Indian woman is, I believe, such a haunting. It will remain as such because there can be no reconciliation as land is lost under diverted river pathways, pollutions of the water continue, and colonial structures are still in place. Let me reiterate, there can be no reconciliation of this. So, let me see. The Indian Maid of the Mist is a ghost, or the sign, or empirical evidence, if you like, which signals that, quote, and this is again Gordon, things are not in their assigned places. So, of course, Gordon was talking about slavery here, but I think there's actually, we can examine more the connections between slavery and settler colonialism, and we should, particularly in Indigenous studies and in geographies. So in the question of the origin story and legitimacy of Canada as a U.S. settler state, I see the history of the Falls symbolized by a fabricated monument of sacrificing Native women as a testament that the U.S. and Canada are always unsettled. Gordon, though speaking again in relation to slavery, is relevant in his assertion that the ghost is not simply a dead or a missing person, but a social figure, and investigating it can lead to that dense site where history and subjectivity make social life. I think this is no more clear than the murdered and missing woman in Canada right now. What does the social life of Canada mean in the wake of the hundreds of dead murdered or missing women, or even those in the United States that are never counted? We don't do as well as in Canada in terms of that. If we visit the intersection of the material site of the creation of hydroelectric power in relation to the death of the Indian maid that is reiterated over and over again for the consumption of heteropatriarchal couples, what is it telling us about the social life of settler Americans and Canadians? Furthermore, why has this story continued to the present? Why has this story, known to have originated from the early explorer La Salle, accepted? La Salle, like many of the men who traveled into our territories, was there seeking to dispossess Haudenosaunee nations from land, and he knew how to get backing by disparaging our character and morality, which was necessary to the point of dehumanizing through a smear campaign. So anybody who wants cares to read the Jesuit journals or La Salle's diaries can find in them filled with these concepts of Haudenosaunee savagery, right? But it was basically to disempower us because we were one of the most powerful nations in the St. Lawrence Seaway, etc. So in order to answer these questions, we also need to address the epistemic violence of naturalizing of Native male violence and Native women's deaths, a reiteration of settler narratives that normatize whose bodies matter and position the already queering of Native coupling, as Mark Rifkin so deftly lays out in his book, When Did Indians Become Straight? Butler, Ahmed, and Puer have illustrated the epistemological and ontological resonances between masculinity and the nation state through heterosexuality as a biopolitical technology of power. Michael Cannon's work also rightly speaks to settler colonial scholarship by connecting the logics of heteronormativity and heteropatriarchy as mechanisms of indigenous elimination and erasure. I incorporate this into a discussion of settler colonial structures at the Falls to speak of the power dynamics that give life to settler priorities that become storied through the death of Native women, savagery of Indian masculinity and communities, all wrapped in a campaign of promoting Niagara Falls as the ultimate symbol of heterosexual coupling. Niagara Falls became a site in which the Canada and the US government first correlated their efforts in terms of controlling hydroelectric energy and tourism between the two states. As early as 1827, with the first opening of a curiosity shop, the tourist industry accumulated Indians into the market economy and touted them as a larger part of the landscape. Tuscarora were particularly well known for their beadwork and often sold bags, pouches, and jewelries at this site. So here I just want to go. We can see the heterosexual coupling. We can see this in early photography, etc. that begins also at that site, and photography being in kind of active realism in a particular way. And we can just see all these images unfold in a particularly whitening of America sort of way as well, here as well. And here is the Tugby's Curiosity Shop that we can see. Over the years, it got built up, and now when you go down there, it's completely built up, but the Maid of the Mist tours are still running as well. So, the link between collecting native objects at Niagara Falls and easing an unsettled national consciousness through collecting of objects deemed past coincided with the ongoing economies of dispossession in relation to native land. As one historian relates, when tourists purchased an actual Indian-made object, here Tuscarora, and took it home as a souvenir, they were in effect taking home a piece of the Indian, and by association, a piece of the falls themselves. The whimsy or related Indian souvenirs then, a symbol and an object, could capture and make tangible something ephemeral and wild. The power and majesty of Niagara. The amount of money spent on these items far exceeded a tourist cost on hotels and food at the falls. So I want to make this clear, right? The economy even at the falls was built on the fingers of Tuscarora women as they beaded away. Capitalism and native dispossession supported these burgeoning tourist shops that quite literally arose with the fabricated story of Indian women's death and the exploitation of Indian women's labor. Tuscarora artist Jolene Rickards writes, "The bark booths have become for me a classic projection of Indian people's place in the economy. Everyone knows that Indian handcrafts are harmless, but what is really negotiated in this trade for money for what we create? The people from Skarura and most other Indian nations develop specific items for exchange. What we create, tourist items or not, serve as a reminder of our spiritual, economic, and cultural survival. The strongest remaining symbol among Tuscarora are the beadwork and the white corn." So this becomes an actually very important statement from Jolene, who's a visual artist and talks a lot about visual sovereignty. So there's a particular way that at the falls, which was Seneca land, and just for those of you who are unaware, the Seneca Nation provided the land for the Tuscarora Nation when those moments of self-determination and sovereignty existed. So it was actually a sovereign move for that, an extending of our rafters, which is why the Tuscarora are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy now. So this is also an impinging in many multiple ways on Haudenosaunee Confederacy, what begins to happen in the displacement of Tuscarora at Niagara Falls. So like the fake story, there's also wide evidence that hucksters came to dominate and sell fake Indian goods, or the kitsch goods that are alienation from that particular labor and those particular beadworks, etc. that existed. And along with this also came the need for tourists to see visually the making of goods at the site in order to grasp the authentic Indians in their hands. So these native performances fed and sustained the Tuscarora through much economic hardships. In 1874, the curiosity shops, hotels, and street hustlers became so problematic at the sites that the councilmen transferred private property to the state for an establishment of a great park that was modeled after places such as New York City's Central Park, right, and Hyde Park in Chicago. In my work, I like to look at the connection between places, not just the differences between places. And so, knowing that Niagara Falls, New York City was one of the richest cities, and Niagara Falls is meant to symbolize Central Park, we can think about that ongoing trade of when vacationing became popular, right? Who was making money off whom kind of burgeoning going on as well. Porter, who had owned, controlled, and had a close relationship with those in adjacent Tuscarora Reservation, made the point of sale transition of land and included a caveat to maintain the rights of Tuscarora women to sell the goods at their falls. Porter was kind of married in, there's a lot of porters now up in that area. So he did have also an investment in that, a personal investment as well. This cleaning up and regulating of the space, and early regulating that is similar to what has gone on in New York City in the neoliberal movement we're in now, was further perpetuated when later Haudenosaunee women needed to obtain a license from the state, of all places, to sell goods at the falls. So for those of you unaware of how Haudenosaunee people operate, we don't take the state as a recognizable nation, right? It's a politics of refusal with that. So to get a license from the state in order to sell your goods was an ultimate act of infringement upon the treaty rights that we have. So the attempted incorporation of Native women into the state through licensing is a continuation of colonial logics of elimination through the restriction of licensing and regulating the tourist industry at the park, right? Remember, they're cleaning up the park, they're getting rid of the hucksters, the inauthentic, etc. So therefore, we have to somehow or Tuscarora have to get licensing there as well. So in speaking of the Kanawake Mohawks who traveled to sell their wares, because a lot of Haudenosaunee people who viewed free travel between our confederacy would come down to the falls to also partake in this particularly important economy, would come as well. But they were being banned at this particular time in a matter of cleaning up. We don't want those, and I'll read this in a second. So in speaking of Kanawake Mohawks who traveled to sell their wares, a local newspaper states that they set up in the, quote, in the park close beside the faithful Tuscarora woman. Of course the latter object, but they have so far said little. The Canadian squaws, it is said, bought 5 big trunks of work with them this season, and they have already announced that next year, Pan-American year, they intend to be on the deck May 1st. The Tuscarora squaws cannot see why the white man's law does not protect them, as well as the products of the whites. Furthermore, the Tuscaroras point out that years ago Tuscarora were, quote, faithful to the stars and the stripes, and today send their sons to fight. People who learned the situation in the park yesterday plainly stated that they thought the Montreal squaws should be asked to retire to Victoria Park. Public sentiment is that Tuscaroras should be undisturbed by foreign competition. I really want to talk about this in relation to domestication, right? In this newspaper article, we see the incorporation of our Indians' language and the language of settler nationalism at work. The domesticating of Native women and lands into tourist industry was further perpetuated upon the need for them to obtain a license to sell goods at the reserved sites, named as such because they reserved land from ever-increasing industry at the site, which I'm going to get to in a minute, right? There's 2 poles, twisting poles going on at Niagara Falls here. Even while one historian of the Falls notes the 1870s and 1880s were the height of nefarious practices in regards to the treatment of Native peoples at the site of the Falls, this is far from the actual case. Settler nefarious practices and swindling were just beginning. So the separation of Niagara Falls as a site of tourist industry from that as a site which introduces infrastructures of electric power in the modern nation state enables these economies of dispossession. So while harnessing of water began in 1748 at the Falls, it was in 1875, here's the Kanawake Mohawk family. I'm a little behind on my slides here. I'm going to catch up here in a second. While harnessing the water began in 1748, it was in 1875 that engineers utilized the natural right angle of the river and curve in the second phase of the harnessing of energy to sustain growth and development in the area. The installation of a small generator would make Niagara Falls the birthplace of the first hydroelectric developments that would create settler colonial infrastructures throughout America and North America. This also gives rise to the Aluminum Company of America and the now I'm going to trip over my words, Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation and Carborundum Company, who located, I'm not a good at science, who located their manufacturing in the area, releasing pollutants that are still found in this particular seaway. So hydroelectric, electrochemical, and electrometallurgical industries would have a profound economic, political, and social impact on this binational area. In many ways, this birth of industry coincided with the rise and need of a sacrificial Indian story in licensing of authentic Indians at the site. The anxiety produced by the destruction of the natural habitat was mediated by the story of authentic Indians. So even while resource extraction drove the politics of the day, many protested the destruction of the pristineness of the site. Parks, under what was then called, ironically, reservations, or not ironically if you think about the BIA move from the War Department to the Secretary of Department of Interior, were established on both sides of the river in 1883 and 1885, around that time of that particular move. So as one scholar studying the tourist industry at the site states, as the setting of the falls became more and more humanized, many visitors found that they could no longer feel the peculiar combination of rapture and terror they associated with the sublime. So as I contend here, the largest part of the sublime were actually Native women, not only in the form of the story about one maiden, but in their material existence selling goods at the falls. Let us again consider Avery Gordon's idea of haunting, in which abusive systems of power make themselves known and their impacts felt on the everyday life, especially when they are supposedly over and done with. Precisely because, as Gordon states, the reality of certain obvious things, and here I would say those obvious things are the the seemingly superior rights of settler nation states try to absorb lands and abandon native bodies, which can blind us then to the ways in which those things are expressly produced and fundamentally enabled by a history of loss and repression. That is, the monument of Niagara Falls comes to stand in for the loss of the primordial. Niagara, and newspaper at the time says, Niagara seemed a survivor and hence a representative of the distant past where nature reigned undisturbed by human will. There are numerous descriptions of this primordial world in the poetry and travel literature of Niagara. Of course, these poetry and travel literatures very rarely take into account the actual stories of that particular land. So, from Haudenosaunee people about the human and the non-human. So the state of Canada and the United States were less concerned about the survival of actual Native people, and in fact, the repression of economies and heavy-handed state tactics worked to ensure our deaths. Again, Avery states that haunting is a meditation, which is a process that links an institution and an individual, a social structure and a subject, and history and a biography. Here, I attest that the biography is that of the seemingly settler permanence of Canada as a state and the US as a state. So rather than Native women being invisible in place, which has been some of the early Indigenous feminist work, I attest that their presence continues to haunt and occupy the premise. So as does the strength of Haudenosaunee politics at the site of Niagara Falls. In many ways, when you walk and visit the various paths and monuments, there is a complete absence of Niagara as Seneca land or part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, even as the Seneca Casino now is the brightest light and shines as one of the largest attractions. And here I would like to say that it's ironic because all the signs as you walk along the path say the neutrals, which is it is a historic term that is used in white documents, etc. But I'm not even sure we have the word neutral in our in our language necessarily. But there becomes a particular way that Haudenosaunee Confederacy remained out of the contest of American Revolution. So, whereas we're taught as young kids, we're the reason America exists, whether that's good or bad. We remained neutral in the U.S. becoming separate from Britain. So it is a willful omission and nothing new to settler structures that they necessitate the erasure of histories, political practices, and ongoing native relationships to land. And here you can see the early Niagara Falls and this deep industrialization taking place as well. And here we can say how Niagara has been harnessed from the American Monthly Review of Reviews as one of the boldest engineering and commercial feats of the past century. The successful development of the water power of Niagara Falls was the signal for the utilization of water powers all over the world. So even while this is a deeply local history, it is one that has a far-reaching scale effect as well, because this in fact is what happened. I choose to directly talk about the origin of damming projects that proceed from the hydroelectric interventions and harnessing of the fall's power as economies of dispossession, as it deters from individuating the processes or regulating native dispossession as a passive act. Land loss is mourned and paints a picture that there was not an active part played by the U.S. and Canadian settler states that acted in concert and whose wealth and economies still proceed from it to this day. In 1890, the Niagara Falls Power Company attempts to generate power from a central source for industries in the area, and competitive industry sends their best scientists to Europe to learn more about the hydraulics in order to figure out how to use this immense power that's at the falls. Edison and Tesla, who I'm sure we're all familiar with those two scientists, were both part of trying to control water flow and the currents of electricity, and the US and Canada entered into international treaties, the first international treaty between them, to create terms where the power would go several times throughout the 1900s. So this treaty was consistently revisited, this binational treaty. This is a topic I tend to expand on in my next iteration of this project. So previously, electricity was scarcely used in industrial projects, and thus the work undertaken at this time would be revolutionary to the building of the US and Canada as industrial settler states. The water treaties of the boundary area, as well as complicit settler tourism between Canada and the US, became key to the development of both nations. The result of harnessing the power of water at Niagara Falls, a sacred place of the Haudenosaunee, was the Atom Station that was, quote, so successful that today all central power stations and transmission systems are modeled after the original Falls project. So this is a profound impact worldwide. So the domestication of Indian land into the state of the nation led to the large engineering projects and infrastructure still largely in place. If one considers Native people as humans, let's just venture out on that, and as living people that are part of the lands, what begins to become evident is not only the ongoing dispossession and bad practices, but how Niagara Falls serves as a flashpoint for damming and controlling of the environment at the expense of Native people's lifeways and future generations. For instance, when conceiving of the dam that would flood Corn Planter and flood Seneca lands, the priorities were clearly laid out by three companies vying for the task. One was to gain as much power as possible, and two, to save the falls as a pristine site for the tourist economy. And we can look at the booklets. This is printed by the Power Commission as well. It's been fairly interesting. I have to go up to I have to go back home and do some more of the work at Lake Erie and some more of that archival work, which is too much to go into here. But these booklets and stuff, I've been, honestly, I've been getting them. I had a great research assistant, and they've been finding some of all the Niagara Falls kitsch and all of this stuff. You can find it on Esri, which has just been really actually quite wonderful. I never thought about that before. So the booklets actually lay into a lot of what, there is actually a whole publicity stunt to harness and ruin the falls and drive this home. The plans to flood, like so many during the New Deal and infrastructure changes, would largely take place out of sight on Indian land. Here we can return to the importance of the haunting death of the Indian maiden, the one who sacrifices her love but must always die. Right? And again, the death of the Indian woman means the death of reproduction of Indianness, right? If heteronormative coupling means the reproductive regeneration of the U.S. as a nation state, we can also begin to think of those connections. So the purposeful telling of the killing by her inhumane and immoral father, who just happens to be the chief of the tribe, even though we have clan mothers, and political symbol of sovereignty, right? It's also important to think of the chief as the political symbol of sovereignty, creates a moral justification for the destruction of tribal lifeways. The death is just an unfortunate consequence of progress in the imagination of the white settler. Native people are denied personhood and thus rights to the land. Native occupancy and relationships to these flooded spaces are rarely considered as terra nullius manifests itself in the colonial mind as much as it does the law. These are nefarious practices indeed. So economies of dispossession require the active dispossession of land, legacies, and personhood. When we talk about these damming projects of the early 19th century, the New Deal and post-World War II, and the harnessing of hydroelectric power, or the destruction of indigenous communities in Latin and South America right now, we must return to the start. That start is Niagara Falls, in which Haudenosaunee land and lifeways became national sacrifice zones as the logics of elimination, well founded in the myths of the Maid of the Mist tours, in its circulation. It is the visual circulation as well that enacts a white settler necropolitics. It is important to remember that settler colonialism is an ongoing process whereby occupation is never-ending condition, and as Madimbe explains, quote, the late modern colonial occupation is a concantation of multiple powers, disciplinary, biopolitical, and necropolitical. And here, that constitute a particular formation of terror. And I mean, I'm not joking. This is the actual building that they constructed. I can't make this up. This is phallic power, right? And so this is the electric building that was created at the site of Niagara Falls, or what is definitely to me a phallic symbol. So this would harness the power of the falls, which would make Buffalo as a city one of the first cities of the West that increased American and Canadian prosperity. So that sense has passed, but that huge industrialization of Buffalo is incredibly important there. So Madimbe refers to this part of the formation as a state of siege. Quote, itself a military institution which allows a modality of the killing that does not distinguish between an internal and an external enemy. Again, think about that newspaper clipping where I read our squaws versus their squaws, right? The domestication of Indian women needs to take place, and as well as domestication and death. Consequently, the value of those marked as excess expresses itself through their targeting for death in settler colonial system of sovereign power, where invisible killing is added to outright execution. As Seneca lands were subsumed for Canada and the U.S.'s industrialization, so were their communities and kinship relations. The heteronormative promotion of Niagara as a honeymoon destination and family vacation spot was centered on the phallic of settler policy. So, aside from what happened here, then we have in the 1930s, we have in the 1950s, but the night began, like some of this construction began in the 1930s, we have the ongoing dispossession and the Kinzua Dam of 1958. So the haunting there remains a haunting of the falls today in this area where water connects place and generations. And here I kind of began at the beginning with Rosie Simmons, who's a choreographer and dance artist, with her talk. But in 1958, what we see here, you can't read it that well, but the signing that takes place here is the clan mothers' protestation of the Kenzuwa damming, which would flood corn planters' land. These were the women whose lands that were being flooded. The tribal council had no, even though there was a lot of protests, etc., the tribal council had no power to give up that land, right? The U.S. had no power. It was the clan mothers' land. So there were lots of protests of the divergences of water by Haudenosaunee in 1958. Johnny Cash wrote a famous song. Hope you've all heard it. Johnny Cash is awesome. Around this as well. Here we have Mad Bear in the corner with the clan mothers' names as well. So this became an actual site where the ongoing building of hydroelectric power and technology continues to dispossess indigenous people. So I want to play just a little bit of Rosie Simmons, who is Seneca as well. And this particular presentation begins in darkness, as we saw, and it ends with she uses WPA and the electric and the civil engineering corps. She grabs their maps and literally they made the divergences of rivers. They used eminent domain to particularly flood and pinpoint native land for that flooding as well, so that it wouldn't flood other parts, that would allow for park pristineness and all those sorts of elements. So within that, 600 families were displaced in the Kenzuwa Dam project, and corn planter lands were flooded forever. So when we're talking about land reclamation and indigenous studies, etc., I've been thinking about land that's lost underwater, whether that's through climate change, Micronesia, or whatever it's from. It's something we haven't talked about, different kinds of loss that may not be permanent, like reclamation, like the Oneida land claims, etc. But we can think about different forms of loss. I think sometimes we flatten out loss a little bit in indigenous studies, and we have to start to think particularly about different forms of loss. So I'm going to play a little clip. I love this clip because she uses the WPA archives. Oh, sorry. She uses the WPA archives to recuperate her grandmother's voice, and if you can, pay attention to the sounds and the music that exist within the film and her dance moves. This is her actual grandmother's dress as well as she's dancing. Those are treaties she has written on the screens behind her that she particularly made up, and then some of the lighting are strands of DNA, and I'll get to that in a second. I don't want to keep you guys here. Move it on. So she starts with the flooding. We go through all the narratives. Here we go. And this is right before the waters rush down with the flooding of the land. So we have the reverberations where she's showing the footage from this flooding on various screens to talk about the vertical depth of memory and cultural memory, and also how that's embedded in our DNA. So I'm just going to go on a little bit because we all want to go back to the line. flooding, we can turn the lights back up too. This flooding would result in the displacement of 600 Native families. I particularly like this because I think about, to return to my uncle's story, I think about the sound that water makes as it's flooding, right? And how seemingly the powerless rose up to create something as magnificent and powerful as the falls themselves. And I think this, to me, one of the critiques of settler colonialism is that it's settled, right? That it's already a formation that's done, right? Whereas for Haudenosaunee people, or many Haudenosaunee people, the US and Canada could go away anytime, right? Like that's not, it's a different temporality that it extends there. People think I sound naive when I say that, but I don't think so, but we can talk about that also. So by exploring the visual postcards and other romanticized propaganda that I've done, and thinking through Rosie Simmons's work, which I hope to be able to incorporate and talk more in. This originally was just going to be a chapter in a book, but I think now it's going to be its own book. And thinking through this particular project that she works through, we can think about not only what has the consistent rhetoric of the death of Indigenous women, and also the material reality of Native women facing death at a higher rate than any other ethnic population. What does this mean, right? So I intend to bring a broader awareness of the geographies and the storytelling that refuse this silencing of the power of the Thunder Beings, and refuse the silencing of what it means for settler colonial power to try to maintain itself. So, thank you. Questions? That was a lot. I went through a lot of history. It's been a quiet crowd today. Any questions? Avram?
I mean, this is so half-formed and your talk is so very rich comparatively, but I keep thinking about monuments.
Yeah.
You mentioned it a few times, right? Like you said walking through Niagara Falls, if you visit, there are no markers or indications or monuments suggesting that this is in fact Haudenosaunee land. And then the building, right, the electric.
Yeah, the valley.
It being so there and present and big. And then like I'm also thinking about Tiger's national monuments,
Yeah.
homes, and I wonder maybe like even in terms of the dance at the end, can a marker or can a monument, something that's supposed to be so monumental, be more ephemeral, like a performance or a poem?
You know, this has come into play a lot when I've been doing my Mapping Indigenous LA project, and there's been a question of monumentalizing massacre sites and monumentalizing these sorts of sites, right? And one of the Tomba's people community members that I work with, and she's a scholar as well, said that they can, as Tomba people, they've consistently fought against development and against concrete or anything that you could see that's not of the natural world. So in fact, that monumentalizing in that particular way would not be the appropriate way to go about that, right? So it's different sets of geographies and how we think about that. So in this talk, I use monumentalizing as the settler state, right? And I know you're familiar with my work with Derderick, where I'm looking at effective mapping of monumentalism and Derderick's poetry, and what she, like even the, the desecration of sites like the Black Hills, and having the 4 westward expansion manifest destiny faces on the Black Hills, right, as a sign of monumentalism of settler state power, right? But there's particular ways that there's been a lot of ephemeral sort of notions that have come and gone, and I think that exists in memory or in cultural memory, right? Where I think that's a hard question. Yeah, I think monumentalizing can be ephemeral. I think what Rosie Simmons is doing in this particular with the soundscapes, the geographies of the soundscape, particularly in her, I highly encourage you guys to watch it. She just won a Guggenheim actually, which I'm very excited for. And she's actually, it relates to her work, she's doing a new dance performance on skin. So yeah, so she's very into thinking about what what the impact of these sorts of violences do, right? So if we can say that in place, our genetics or our bodies are made in place also, right? We talk a lot about pollution or destruction, but not the positive ways that place makes us who we are, right? So I think in some ways what Rosie Simmons is doing is getting away from a monumentalizing that's about state power and kind of thinking about the regeneration of the body as a site, really, in terms of that as a body's connection to place. And so in the last one, she talks kind of about epigenetic violence, and I gotta work this out a little more. I just saw a talk by Shanina Loma-Waima, and Shanina was talking about if epigenetics works as a damaging effect on the genetics, what does it do for settler power? What does it do for white power? What does it do for white people, right? That because they experience the positiveness of settler colonialism. So what does that do in the reverse, which is an important question, I think. So I think this is kind of a new area of thinking of the body, monumentalizing, but not in a way that has a logics of containment through blood quantum or through these sorts of ways that the state seeks to contain it. So I don't know, that might be a longer question. Can it be ephemeral? But I would say yes, it can. I think there's lots of things that are ephemeral that last in memory, like the, wampum belts and the recitation of that. Whether it's the walk across the Canadian border, U.S. border to recognize the Jay Treaty every year. That's an ephemeral act, but it's a monumental one. So, does that answer your question? Yeah. Are there other questions? No, you all want to go back to the one? Katie?
I guess I just had a comment. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm really excited to see the book of this. I was just thinking about the connections of kind of like Native women in performance and water, like bodies of water. Like for example, if we look at like Lake Tahoe, which is the center of the Washoe people, Native women were brought there to basket weave and all that. And so this idea of kind of like them representing, that wild kind of fleeting, vanishing Indian, and at the same time, of course, being exploited in that way, but it's still part of the economy. So I guess we're kind of like seeing where their labor becomes necessary for their survival, and yet it does also become part of something that's exploited. And nowadays, I think it's very absent. Like, I don't think you would necessarily find, beadwork, for example, unless you're at like maybe, a Seneca-owned smoke shop or something in the area.
Yeah.
It's very invisible now, I think, and Native women's labor at those sites. So just something I was seeing,
These Tuscarora purses now are worth like $10,000.
Right, exactly.
It's like insane.
Yeah.
And the same can be said with Navajo rugs. Kathy McCluskey, who works on she does textile weaving, she's a historian, has gone through all the accounting of what Navajo rug making did in terms of sustaining the wool industry in all of the Southwest. That was done through Navajo women's labor, through their craft and labor, which then in turn is not recognized because it was seen as something women do in the home, during that time. Yeah, but I do think there's a definite way that these economies circulated. And you saw some of the photos of in advertisement, it was always the Tuscarora woman selling knives or selling beadwork or these sorts of things. So there were traders that set up and did that as well. But I think you find that even in the basket industry the basket industry is another one, right? Like older baskets are worth tons of money now. Yeah, so I think it's an ongoing sort of economy, but Native people are alienated from that particular labor now, right? So their death becomes like the complete alienation from that labor. Other questions? Well, yeah, Savannah? Okay, somebody other than my students here. Former students, I should say.
So you were talking about like the Niagara Falls as a site. What's it called when people get married with the dog?
Honeymoon?
Honeymoon, yeah. Honeymoon site, kind of regenerating the white heteronormative settler nation. How do you see those projects also like disciplining or regulating like indigenous genders and sexualities in that area? Like, do you see that as kind of like a dual process happening? Or?
Well, I was going to bring up, now it's become a site of homonormativity, right? Because as now with gay marriage, etc., they're trying to repackage Niagara Falls as a site to go in terms of kitsch, like, you know, gay marriage sites, the whole thing, right? So now it's become this place of homonormativity. So I'll say that for one thing. I don't know how it regulates. I think when I asked like my uncle and I asked some of my relatives or even asked some other Tuscarora, I had a conversation with a couple other Tuscarora scholars and stuff who know intimately this area, right? Their parents were the ones who were making grandparents and such. Jolene Rickards as well. They didn't refer to these purses as whimsies, but they referred to them as this thing that kept people living. But nobody looked at it as, nobody takes the story seriously. It's just that crazy thing that white people say about us, you know, again. And I didn't go into the Boyeren thing, but there's a particular way Haudenosaunee people in Canada, more in Canada because of Oka and because of other practices, such as standoffs with both settler states actually, have that idea of savagery, or we're savage, or we're militant, or we're this or that, you know, is something that people just kind of dismiss in a way. So I'm not sure, the story itself doesn't regulate any is seen as ridiculous because clan mothers have such a presence, particularly when you're talking about Seneca, and close to Niagara Falls is Tonawanda Seneca, and particularly who rejected the IRA Act of 1934 by John Collier because we wanted to maintain our traditional clan mother picking the chief, etc., right? Which had deep repercussions for us in terms of political economies, starvation, etc. So the rejection of those forms, the story just becomes so ridiculous and not really a control. And I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture here, like, you know, definitely not. I just spent a whole weekend with my brother, who's a millwright. So most of our men do that kind of, you know, work. So there are a lot of nuances there that, but I'm not sure how the regulation of sexuality or indigeneity of indigenous people really plays into that. What I think people get concerned about with Niagara Falls is the destruction of the place. And actually, you know, when I talked to my uncle, he actually he doesn't care whether the story's told there or not because it will just become part of the tourist economy. And a lot of people you talk to, you know, there's this move towards monumentalizing the factual or the actual stories or whatever of that place. A lot of Native people don't want that because I see what has happened to Native Hawaiians or other people who have tried to do that, which just becomes kind of enveloped in settler state power, right? And becomes some kind of kitsch thing, and it takes away that power of that story, right? So I don't know if that makes any, I don't know.
Question. I'm interested in, you know, is the Niagara Falls considered a national park? And if so, have you noticed that there is any conflict between Native activists who are part of the EJ movement, like environmental justice movement, and mainstream environmentalists over conservation issues, for example? And do they consider the history of Native people as a part of, or is conservation something that they're in conflict over with this population?
Yeah. Well, I don't think any more development is taking place there because it's such a tourist site, and now some of the industrial powers have moved.
Right, but like some of the tourism is drawn by ecotourism.
Yeah.
People like go visit places because they think that they're contributing to the national parks.
Yeah.
And to the environmental sustainability of people visit national parks because they think that they're being eco-friendly.
Yeah. But see, Niagara Falls doesn't have that same sort of, like Yellowstone. It doesn't have that same sort of thing. Like, people literally go there because that narrative of the honeymoon site, or that narrative of that old-timey place, or the lights of, you know, that's why electric lights and tourists, right? The electric lights of that are very, very strong. I mean, it is a park, but it's not. It's the falls themselves. I mean, they make tons of money through that tour missed, right? But I'm not sure. I mean, I can't tell you what the tourists are thinking. I think most of the time they think, oh, this is, check it off my list of the things in the U.S. you should see before you die, kind of thing, right? But oddly tied into this kind of honeymoon sort of notions as well. The Seneca Casino is right there, and it's actually the brightest thing down there now. It's like crazy, but it doesn't seem to have much integration at all with the tourist industry is there. I mean, of course they make a lot of money off the tourist industry and the casino itself, but even in the casino itself, it doesn't have a story of Niagara Falls. It doesn't talk about the Thunder Beings. It doesn't tell the story of the pre-human that my uncle told. It's seen as a site of money making, right? But I mean, there's a power. I don't know. Is there somebody? Okay.
So you talked about how, like, one of the economies of dispossession that work here is that Niagara Falls becomes the site of, or like the condition of, becomes a site of like hydroelectric power and the condition of possibility for like, settler colonial expansion
and imperialism eventually.
Imperialism and a particular period of like industrialization, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like, I'm thinking about that picture you showed us of Buffalo, and Buffalo is of course like in the entire kind of northeast corridor. There's definitely it's part of like a kind of post-industrial landscape, and so I'm wondering like how do you understand this particular economy of dispossession in this post-industrial moment?
That's a great question. So Buffalo was the first city that was powered on a power grid, right? Which led to its rise at that particular time. A post-industrial Buffalo, I hadn't really thought about it. I'm just, let me think for a second. I think in terms of settler geographies, whenever I say I'm from Tonawanda, people are like, oh, you're from Buffalo. And it's like, no, I'm not from the suburb Tonawanda. So there's a particular also a nostalgia, this colonial nostalgia that gets put in place through the place names and all of these sort of versionings. And I mean, the fact is it's still occupied territory, right? And that's still Seneca land, and University of Buffalo is on university land in that same way. So I still see it as part of that ongoing economies of dispossession until it's unsettled. But I mean,
Maybe the economy has been reconfigured, and if so, how?
yeah, I'm not sure what the economy of Buffalo is, if they have one, if they have one in this post. But I do. It's not just Buffalo. I'm talking. It's Canada as well, right? Like Canada becomes that becomes an important site for hydroelectric power for Canada as well, which became instrumental in the James Bay later on, flooding and the damming there, which is some of the other work that I've been looking at. So I mean, I don't know what the economies of Buffalo are like right now. That's not really. I mean, I look at it as settled, and there's still capitalism occurring there, and I don't know if the economy is any land-based economy or what they have there. So, sorry. I do know at one point it was that site of chemical plants, all of that were produced in industrialization in order to harness water and electricity during that particular time. But I think as the technology became more ubiquitous, all those plants moved other places. Other questions? No? We good? I'm looking at Savannah. Thank you.